better. That was like, at that time I only could find like this Douglas fir wood, and so they got a better set. But I tried selling that set to just anybody. Nah, just the bottom piece is a bubble. I mean, I tried selling them for cheap online without polying them because I'm not going to poly them. I don't have legs on it yet, but I can put legs on it. You want them? Cornhole. They're American flag cornhole boards. They're just not polyed. Well, yeah, me too. Yeah, yep. I tried, like I said, selling them, but nobody bought them. So. But I'll drop them off, or you won't be. That's right, you're working tomorrow. So. No, I wouldn't say no. Not the best. Yeah. I know. Are you going to use that? He sits back here. Oh yeah. Yes. It's a big piece. I was really close. Actually, last week I almost did. I was thinking about it. Like, yeah. Nope. Okay. Yep. Yep. Nope. Nope. You're good. Nope. Nope. No, I won't do that now. Yeah. No. Yeah. No, we don't want no big. We got enough books back there, as you can tell. There you go. Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah, it's straightened out. Yep, it is straightened out now. It got stuck at 45, I think. So, but it's good now. So, all right. Well, good evening. Good to see everybody here this evening. Hope you guys again have been having a good week so far. In the line of prayer requests, if you can, Brother Carl had mentioned that he had to travel to Chicago to just help Cheryl and Jay and the boys and stuff. Just if you can, just remember them, remember their family. I know, remember Brother Harold, he was having some issues Sunday, but Sister Bonnie said that he was feeling a lot better once he got home. So just remember him. Brother Elton and Sister Jean, they're getting better. They stated they weren't feeling too good on Sunday either. So, but just, they said they're getting better. So remember them. And Sister Brenda, is Sister Brenda?
She does have an appointment for chiropractor Monday.
All right, good. Let's continue to remember her. I know Brother Alan Quinn was home for the weekend. Had a good time. Good.
It was busy, but it was good. Did anybody find Easter eggs on Sunday? No. I even hid a bunch up there. I was like, yeah, Pastor and Patrick are gonna get up there and be like,
Did you hide some Easter eggs?
I did, and they would be like, why are there eggs? But I guess the kids found them, so yeah.
Yeah, the kids must have because I didn't.
Because I put them in the pews and like everything. I'm like, people are gonna be finding eggs all over the place.
Hey, if there was like dollars in there, like money, man, I'm gonna find the kids that took them. Say those were mine. No.
The one church I went to in Breezeville, they used to put $2 silver in them big egg things. They quit doing it for 2 years. And kids went out and found some, like 5 of them had
Mm-hmm.
$silver there. And they've been out there in them egg things for 2 years, and they quit doing it. And the kids went out and found them, and then 2 years later, some kids found some more. And they quit
That's why
doing
you do plastic and you don't do real eggs.
Yeah, they were putting $silver.
Because you don't know what you're gonna find later on with some of those eggs. So, but.
They had some big ones, and the funny part is, somebody put $50 in one, and it was never found. 2 years later, someone found one for $50.
Man, I wish I could have found that. No, I'm just kidding. But Brother Allen made it back. He made it back to the. Okay, all right. So again, remember Brother Allen if you can in your prayers. Again, I know remember the Quinn family too. Remember Brother Carlos keeps on saying that he is getting better. They turned his pump valve off or pump off.
Well, he broke the valve.
Oh, he didn't tell me that.
And so they just told him, hey, just turn it off right now.
Mm-hmm.
He said he's feeling good
he didn't tell me it broke. He just said that just pray that the liquids would absorb. So remember Brother Carlos in your prayers. Also, Brother Mick, got to visit with him Monday. He seemed to look really good compared to what I've seen in the past. So I told him that. I said, you look good Monday, and he told me, he said, your eyes are messed up. I said, well, not like that, but you sounded good. But he's got a doctor's appointment tomorrow, so if you can't remember that in prayers, not sure if they'll pull the chest tube out or not this Thursday, but possibly next Thursday, so just continue to remember him. Also remember the loss in our community. I did hear that Coloma did call the pastor that had come in view of calls, so just if you can remember Coloma, and also remember the gentleman that's going to be coming up here to minister there. So that's all the prayer requests that I have. Are there any prayer requests anybody else would like to make mention of tonight, Brother John?
Dave from Ben Bulldog, I think prayers helped his back, now his neck's acting. Sometimes he gets on the radio and sometimes he don't. He finally put one downstairs so he can get on the radio without him going upstairs, because the stairs hurts his back.
All right, let's remember
He got the same radio I do.
this one. All right, any other prayer requests anybody would like to make mention of? I know Brother Jim's homesick, remember him?
Just be keeping Destiny in prayer. She has high blood pressure. They don't know why. She's had it for 2 years now, but with her pregnancy, it's gotten a little bit more like out of control. So just hoping that she can go as far as she can in her pregnancy without like any complications and having to take baby early.
All right, let's remember this one. Any other prayer requests? Sister Connie?
On that note, remember Samantha, Brandon's wife, because she had her first ultrasound and everything's going good, but she's been having a lot of nausea and stuff. Pray for her.
I almost said, I forget they're married, and I almost was like, what's her last name? Durand. I know that. Been a long day. Been a long day. But yes, let's remember this one. And any other prayer requests anybody would like to make mention of? Brother John?
I got unspoken.
All right. Any other unspoken? All right. Just remember these. Any other prayer requests? All right. If not, Brother Paul, do you want to open us up in a word of prayer?
Heavenly Father, we thank you for the opportunity to come before you once again. Thank you for this class, Lord. We thank you. Lord, we pray for all those that have requests, Lord, that you minister to them as only you can, Lord. And I always ask you that, Lord, there's a reason for it because you see everything and we don't. And so, Lord, we just put our trust in you, that you have your will in each and every one of these prayer requests and those that were unspoken, Lord. And we ask tonight, Lord, our minds be open and bless Brother Larry as he presents the lesson. And Lord, we can go out and share the word.
Amen. All right, we're going to be in James chapter 5 tonight. James chapter 5. We're going to be talking about riches here tonight. Wealth and the love of money has always plagued humanity in some way. Okay, whether possessions, and again, it could be in money. James is going to be dealing with this inside of these first 6 verses tonight. Again, what we're going to be looking at, dealing with rich men in particular. Now, if you remember in the previous lessons that we've talked about, James has mentioned rich men, that the fact that these individuals were showing partiality towards a rich man. So rich man was mentioned there. James also mentions in a sense that rich men also were oppressing them, the ones that they were giving favor or partiality to. Later on in chapter 4, James talked with the desires of the flesh and the lust of the flesh, and that they were not submitting themselves to God. They were really, again, allowing Satan to really run rampant in their lives. And so, James, coming on that from last week, they were boasting about what they had. In the previous verses 13 through 17, they boasted about, well, hey, tomorrow I'm going to go and I'm going to live in the city, and then I'm going to buy and sell, and I'm going to get gain, is what we had looked at. And they rejoiced in their boastings about the things that they had. coming into chapter 5 and in these verses 1 through 6, it has me to believe that these rich men, in particular, were believers, although that I do, and again in my studies, still wonder and contemplate that, if James is speaking to, as a rich man in here, as believers or not. So we'll just dive into these verses here tonight. Again, James is going to be talking about money, possessions, and really the fact of living a life that is not pertaining to living godly, but rather living a life that is pertaining to what this world can give us. And so James' focus is going to be on wealth here, and in particular these men that were very rich. And he's going to focus on their attitude that they had, and even talk about judgment that is going to come because of the things that they were doing. And so let's, if we can, dive into this. Verse 1. Let's do this. Let's start on this side. Mom, if you want to start, we'll read James chapter 5. We'll read verse 1, one verse at a time, to verse 6.
Go to now, you rich men, weep and howl for your miseries that shall come upon you. Your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten.
Your gold and silver is cankered, and the rust of them shall be a witness against you, and shall eat your flesh as if were fire. Ye have heaped treasures together for the last days.
Okay, Sister Kay.
Behold, the hire of the laborers who have reaped down your fields, which have come after by fraud, the cries of them that have reaped are entered into the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth.
Ye have lived in pleasure on the earth, and been wanton, and have nourished your hearts as in a day of slaughter.
He hath condemned and killed and judged the just, and he does not resist you.
All right, that is where we're going to stop here tonight. In verse 1, the first part we see, go to now, he says, ye rich men. And inside of the verses that you guys read, James kind of gives the character of these rich men and their attitude that they had toward their laborers, okay? He describes them, first of all, as rich men. Again, he says that they really haven't obtained this great wealth that they had, or have become rich or wealthy and have great possessions through integrity, okay? James, in these verses, when he calls them these rich men, these men had gained their riches through wicked and evil ways, okay? Really, they were using, they were abusing it with pride, oppression, we read in these verses, and cruelty, okay? As James writes inside of the verses that you guys had just written. And so the character of these men was not very good. They were not very nice rich men. Again, I'm going to state this and make sure that we had this stated out. Having money and having possessions is not wrong, okay? Having a nice house is not wrong. Having a nice vehicle is not wrong, okay? What is the rule? Those possessions take hold of us, okay, that's where it's bad. Or if we put those possessions ahead of God, that's where things go bad. What does Scripture says? It doesn't say that money is evil, but what? The love of money is the root of all evil, okay? These individuals, these rich men, again, whether coming off the verses in chapter 4, describing these people, again, those that were boasting in what they had and boasting in their lives that they had. James says this, he says, go to now, ye rich men. Again, we've described their character. We see that it says, weep and howl, for your misery shall come upon you. Okay? They themselves, and again, this is why I believe he was speaking to rich men that were part, again, that are saved. And again, actually because of these previous verses in chapter 4 that he mentioned here. But they themselves were depending upon their riches to secure their future. They put their future on what they were going to sell or what they were able to gain, all right? They themselves, this attitude, as you can see in chapter 4 at the end of it, it seems like they themselves had reached a pinnacle of success, And I believe, as James has written in the end of chapter 4 and also coming into verse 5, these individuals spent a lot of time gloating about their possessions or gloating about their monetary or whatever or money that they had in their bank accounts, all right? And I can guarantee you that they never imagined that there was ever going to be a time that they would ever have to really worry about their future or that those things would be taken away from them. And so when James writes, "Go to now, ye rich men," he tells them, "Go weep and go howl for your miseries that shall come upon you." Okay? Again, coming off of chapter 4, the Apostle Paul, we're dealing with general epistles. And so I'm used to saying Peter, James, and all these other. James, I apologize. James, what James wrote in these verses, he says that you're rejoicing in verse 16, but now you rejoice in your boastings, and all such rejoicing is evil. So again, coming off of chapter 5, when he tells them, "Go to now then, ye rich men," don't go rejoicing in these things or boasting these evil thoughts, but he says, you go weep and howl for your miseries that are going to be coming your way. James reveals to them, these individuals that have been rejoicing in their boastings, he reveals a time that was going to be coming and a situation that was going to be coming in their lives that they were not ready for. James says instead of gloating about what they had obtained, he said they ought to weep and howl for what was going to be coming and what they were going to face one day. This word weep, I find interesting. It means this. It speaks of an intense agony. Okay? It carries the idea to sob out loud or to lament over something. This word in particular was often used to describe someone that expressed emotion of the loss of a loved one. Okay? And so James says, "Go to now and weep." He says an intense agony or to sob out loud or to lament because of the times that were coming to them. Howl is, again, another interesting word, and it means shrieking or screaming intensely. Okay? You almost think about it, it's almost like a very extreme outburst of grief. Okay? These individuals themselves were able to rejoice in their boastings for what they had obtained through their desires of their flesh or what they have gotten from their desires of their flesh. But James says that, listen, there is coming a time that they're going to have extreme outburst of grief. Okay? A time that was coming. Such intense emotion was expected for the miseries, again, that they themselves were going to encounter. What they sat there and enjoyed at the moment and focused on of those things, James says you guys are going to face miseries, you guys are going to face hardship, and he says you guys are going to face suffering because of this. All right? Now, these individuals you read in chapter 4 as we looked at, they themselves were deceived. Okay? How were they deceived? Well, they were deceived by their possessions. They were deceived by the things that they had. They were deceived by their wealth. And again, we know that they rejoiced in those things. And so James knew that they were deceived, and again, thinking that they never would be in want ever, but he urged them to have deep sorrow and grief because suffering was going to come. Now, isn't it tragic to really think about and to consider those thoughts that James is writing to those individuals, and again, I believe to be believers, that they themselves, and again, people might say, well, James wouldn't state these kind of things about, believers. He called them adulterers and adulteresses, okay? James is pretty stern about them, that they were committing spiritual adultery already, okay? And that they themselves, again, were after the flesh. They were warring and fighting. And so James here, we understand, is, listen, as you think about that thought process, but how many today are living on top of the world, and even children of God, right, that are living on top of the world, profess to be saved, they're focused on more of the future than focused on God. They're focused on their possessions, focused on their wealth, never thinking that anything could ever hinder their prosperity or hinder these things. But one day they could all go to an end, all right? Remember what James said, that life is but a vapor, all right? That things can change in an instant. And so as James describes in verse 1 to them, he says these men that were boasting rejoicing in their boastings, all of such rejoicing is evil. Therefore to him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is sin. And James says right after that in verse 5, go to now, ye rich men, weep and howl, for your misery that shall come upon you. There was coming a time that, again, whenever that was, there was coming a time that they were going to face grief, and they were going to be crying out with intense emotion and outburst because of the things that had befallen them. Now, why does James get so stern? As you guys had read in verse 2 and 3, James says this, your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver is cankered, and the rust of them shall be a witness against you, and shall eat your flesh as it were fire. Ye have heaped treasure together for the last days. Okay? You guys read, right? Their money and wealth had come from greed, and had come from corruption, okay, ultimately, all right? And they boasted in that corruption, and we'll talk about that when we get to verse 4. But he talks of the corruption. James says, your riches are corrupted. And he says, your garments are moth-eaten, your gold and silver is cankered. Now, I want you to keep in mind, James is attacking their attitude towards their towards their wealth and towards their power, okay? They had arrogance to think that nothing could take that away, and that what they were doing, even taking money from their hired laborers, that they were fine and that they were okay with doing that. And James says, listen, because of these things and because of how you're doing it, he's like, listen, guys, he said, your money and your riches are corrupted, okay? They obtained their wealth and riches through pride, through arrogance, and through greed. And have you ever wondered this? Ever thought about this? Possessions, money, however it is, how much that can take a hold of us and take you and I out of reality. They thought they were doing good, right? Hey, my bank account's, rising up, and I'm fine, all right? James said, no. He said, your riches that you have are corrupt, all right? The possessions that you have, the garments are moth-eaten, your gold and silver, he says, is cankered. And I even find interesting, he states this, he said, and the rust of them shall be a witness against you, and shall eat your flesh as it were fire. James gives them a warning in verse 3 at the end of that. Not only basically kind of knocking everything that they put their faith in at that time, their garments, their riches, right? Their gold, their silver. All of their rejoicing was in those things, right? They boasted about it. But James gives a truth here. Everything in the life that they lived of luxury, seeking only to please themselves to the cost of others, he said that the rust of them, your gold, your silver, the rust of them shall be a witness against you. Okay? Not only that, he says their corruption will also eat their flesh as it were fire. Now that's an interesting statement that James writes here, and again, but it reveals here a truth, I believe, for you and I, is this. What does fire do?
Fire destroys stuff.
It what? It consumes. Okay? Fires consume. And not only consume, but as fires consume, fires can destroy, can't they? Okay? We've seen it in Tennessee, where cabins were destroyed, actually, and homes were destroyed in Tennessee just this past spring break because a little tiny fire had started from a power line. Listen, fires consume and they destroy. When James says this, and shall eat your flesh as it were fire, he's not stating that these riches and these garments and this gold and silver. He's not stating that's fire, right? But he makes a statement. He says, and shall eat your flesh as it were fire. Okay? So he gives almost this application here to them that as they have put their faith and trust in these possessions, these riches, have gloated about it, have boasted on it, rejoiced in those boastings, James says that those things are going to destroy. Number one, they're going to consume, as Brother Mark had said, they're going to consume your life. And they're also going to destroy your life. Why? We're seeing it, aren't we, in Scripture? James writing about how that it's affecting them. They aren't in reality, are they? In their minds, they think, hey, we're good. All right, hey, I'm making money. I got money. I'm doing good. And they were rejoicing and boasting about these things. And again, James attacked them and said, hey, he said, your boastings are evil. All right? James says that they're going to consume them, and eventually they're going to destroy. Think about this. If we focus on things of this world and the possessions of this world, and again, the riches of this world, and that is our focus, can that not consume you? Yeah. All right, it can. If that's our number one priority, that is going to consume us. And upon us it consuming us and our attention and our lives, then what can happen? It can destroy us. You know how many people have been destroyed because of the love for money? The love for riches? Okay. I can list a lot of celebrities in a sense that their lives have been destroyed because of money. James says, this is going to be a witness against you. The rust of them shall be a witness. And he says that it shall eat your flesh as it were fire. Ye have heaped treasure together for the last days. Okay? Their possessions was their God. Okay? That was who they had in front of them. All right? It wasn't God, number one. But their possessions was their number one priority. And they gloated in those things. All right? Listen. Again, not wrong to have possessions, not wrong to have money, okay? But if those things are put in front of God, that's when the issue starts, all right? And that's what they were doing. James says this. He says in verse 3 again that they have heaped treasure together for the last days. And not only that, he says verse 4, behold, the hire of the laborers who have reaped down your fields, which is of you kept back by fraud, crieth. Now I want to stop there for just one moment, okay? Again, in my study, I believe these rich men to be believers. So we're going to state this. If this is children of God, they are gloating or rejoicing in their boastings about what they have, okay, right? Okay? Look what I have. Hey, man, I'm good. I'm going to be fine. I'm good through tomorrow. And James says, no, you're not. He said, you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow or even further on in the next week or next month. But James says, behold, the hire of the laborers who have reaped down your fields. Somebody might read this text and say, well, wait a minute. Well, what's wrong with having the possession? Listen, what's wrong with having the money? These guys were ripping off their labor. And James calls it fraud. He says, ye rich men, now especially if this is children of God, listen, they ought not to be doing this, right? But they were. Listen, it wasn't enough. They were heaping treasure together for the last days, but they were doing it wrongfully, all right? They were hiring their laborers. They were reaping their fields, the laborers were, but they kept back by fraud, and enough to make them cry out. All right? They had cried out to God. So they themselves, we've seen this attitude right and before. They show partiality. We almost see an insensitivity here as they sat there and kept back money that was deserved by the workers that they had. Basically, they took advantage of the laborers. And taking money from them. And they benefited from taking that money from them. Has anybody ever had money cheated from them before? I won't give names, but when I worked at Waltz, There was a secretary no longer there. There was a secretary there, and I was a young gun at that time. I had no clue. I was just excited that I was getting paid overtime. And it was about 2 years' worth. I was sitting there, and I'd be working. We were working about 48 hours a week, and so working there, well, this lady went on vacation, and Walt sat there, and he was in her room in the office all week. Walt didn't say a thing. Our time cards were in that room, and he was like, you couldn't even go in there for the time card. Very secretive, and we're like, hey, what's going on? Well, come to find out, that secretary had been embezzling money from Walt. While me, not thinking about it, I think I made $8 at that time. And so I didn't know overtime was time and a half. And I think that's 12, right? Making sure, am I right? Before I tell the story wrong. $12, right? Is 8, right? Time and a half? Okay, make sure. All right. Yep. Yeah, I think it's 12, I'm pretty sure. So my buddy Scott was sitting there looking at my paycheck one time. He sat there and he's like, man, he said, you're not getting paid your full amount for overtime. And I was like, what are you talking about? I'm like, man, I've been getting more than what I used to get paid. I'm happy. He's like, no. He said, you're getting $10.50. He said, you should be getting $1.50 more. I'm like, no way. And I'm like, you're right. I should be. She was embezzling money out of my check, which is a little bit of money, but over a 2-year span, I mean, that does add up, which Walt did not know. Walt did pay me back for the money that was taken out and stuff, which he didn't have to, but he did. But it's not fun being cheap when you find out. You're like, really? Like, I trusted you to pay me, that my wage, and, you're trusted by the company to pay everybody else's wages. That's what these people were doing, right? Basically, these owners, right, these rich men were embezzling money from their workers and taking advantage of their work and cheating them out of their labor for what they did, okay? Again, we can all state that, again, that happens inside of our world today. We know that. But it should not happen. We know that, number one. Number two, if James is writing about believers here, it really ought not to be, again, part of their lives, okay? I find interesting in verse 4 when James says this, that, again, that they kept back by fraud, their laborers crieth, and he says this, and the cries of them which have reaped are entered unto the ears of the Lord Sabaoth. Okay? The greed that they had did not go unnoticed. We may think that those attitudes or those things go unnoticed, and they may go unnoticed by man, but God heareth the cry. All right? And God specifically, as James writes, he heard their cry, and he heard the cry of the oppressed. And again, it had reached his ears. And it's interesting, this Lord of Sabaoth, it describes God as sovereign commander of the armies of heaven. So not only sovereign God, but it carries the idea of the sovereign God in command of the armies of heaven. I don't know about you, but I don't want to have the armies of heaven coming down on me. Do you? And coming attacking me? No, all right? But James gives a very stern warning to them that they may have enjoyed power, they may have enjoyed prominence over other people in their lives, but know, okay, that these oppressed that have cried unto God, God heard their prayer, and there was a time coming, all right? And it wasn't just to, James didn't use this little terms there, right? Listen, sovereign God, who's in control of everything, he knows, all right? James wrote, he knows your heart. He knows what's going on. He's going to state, better watch out, because there's a day coming, all right? I think a good application for our lives would be this, is that inside of these verses, the fact of this is that God sees the lives that we live. God knows our hearts, all right? God knows everything, and just as much as he was sovereign back when James was writing this letter, that same God is sovereign today and knows everything. All right, and knows our hearts. He knows our motivations. He knows the attitudes that we possess. And again, our motivations that drive you and me. And one day, whether in a sense if it is now at this moment or today or tomorrow, again, whether that or not, you and I will give an account for the life that we lived. And again, I don't know about you, but I don't want to be in these shoes as these rich men oppressing these people and again, be guilty of that. All right? Verse 5, he says this, ye have lived in pleasure on the earth and been wanton. Ye have nourished your hearts as in a day of slaughter. Okay? So basically, James, again, writing them, he says, you've reaped these benefits by fraud. God has heard their cry of these laborers who you've held back money for. He says to them, again, pointing back to them, ye have lived in pleasure on the earth. Okay? You have lived your life the way you want to. Things have gone good. You have been wanton. You have nourished your hearts. Not God has nourished your hearts, but they have nourished their hearts as in a day of slaughter. That carries the idea of this, that they were so driven by such an appetite to have more and more and more and more, right? They had such an appetite for more, yet they were never filled by the things that they had gotten. It had never seemed to be enough. And so everything that they had acquired and continued to acquire, they wanted more. All right? And they wanted more. And they wanted more. Listen, contentment is possible, isn't it? Okay. Apostle Paul wrote, he said that he was content, right? Whether he was abased or whether he was, what's the other word I'm looking for? Abound, right? Abound, is that the word? Abounding or abased. Either or, whether poor or rich, he was content. These individuals, they weren't content. And they lived on the pleasure of this, on this earth. They lived in pleasure on this earth. They have nourished their hearts, and as in a day of slaughter. And that, again, that carries that idea that basically that they themselves, that they just are, they're gluttonous. Okay? They just constantly have filled themselves as much as they possibly could with the pleasures of this world, with the desires of the flesh, and they just keep on wanting more, basically to fatten up for the day of slaughter, okay, is what that idea is. Just to seek and obtain more. James writes to him, he says, listen, this should not be so. He says in verse 6, not only were they continuing to want more, verse 6 he says, ye have condemned and killed the just, and he doth not resist you, okay? Here when James declares that, again, much of their wealth, again, had come at the expense of others. They had oppressed their brethren. They had oppressed the weak, even to the point of death. When he says, ye have condemned and killed the just, and he doth not resist you. Okay? Why? The just were not able to resist the oppression. Okay? When we read in James chapter 1, what was going on with these individuals? What do we read? What were they dealing with? Do you remember? They were scattered. We know that. Okay, the 12 tribes that were scattered. Why were they scattered? Being persecuted. All right, the Church of Jerusalem was being persecuted at that time. So they at that time, again, probably have lost a lot of, lost jobs that they were scattered abroad. They probably didn't have money, probably didn't have homes in a sense of what they had before when they left. And so you can imagine that they would not have the opportunity to resist, okay? And that they would have to be underneath this oppression, okay? And they use their wealth to get more power and to get more, all right? Basically, they themselves were influenced by the desires of the flesh. They were influenced by greed, okay? And it affected people. You know, I didn't mention these verses, you think about them. Verse 4 and in verse 6, people are mentioning that. How we live our lives doesn't just affect us, but it always affects other people. When they were committing fraud and taking money from their laborers, that affected the other people's lives. In verse 6, when it says, ye have condemned and killed the just, and he doth not resist you, listen, it affected people. Sometimes, in a sense, with how much we have a desire, or how much we're going for the flesh and desires of the flesh and trying to obtain and continue to obtain, that can hurt other people that are around us. All right? Not only that, you think about this. The people that were their laborers, it doesn't say that these laborers were their brethren in particular, but you could imagine that they probably had laborers that might have been lost, and they had this attitude. And again, if one professes to be a child of God, and again doing these things, it really doesn't show a good witness or testimony of Christ. And so these wealthy basically were manipulating others for their own financial gain. I believe the same people that James is writing to, again, that they were rejoicing in their boastings, okay, because of what they had and what they have obtained. James writes to them their attitude. They shouldn't have these characteristics, or they shouldn't have this attitude of greed, again, to where it affects other people, okay? Why? James says, and I believe going back to verse 17 in chapter 4, therefore to him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is sin. So these rich men that were oppressing people and taking money from them, they were called out by James. And upon that, if they continued to do that, they would know that they were living in sin. So as James focused on possessions and how that the desires of the flesh had influenced their lives, we have to be careful that how possessions and how riches can affect our lives. All right? Where is our focus? Where is our attitude? What are we trusting in today? Because if we're trusting in things of this world today, they all could be gone tomorrow. Does anybody have any comments on those verses at all, 1 through 6? Pretty simple statements that James puts out there, but very, very stern warnings that he puts out. But
I see a lot of things in here, Brother Mark. I see that when we talk about rich, it doesn't have to be, billionaires.
no.
People that put their trust in their things. And of course the fraud. But I see that with them doing that, they haven't prepared themselves for what's about to happen.
Yep.
And so that's when you see, you ever notice when the stock market, I forget what year it was in, that it really fell. A lot of them just put everything in the stock market and were committing suicide. They just couldn't handle it. And when we don't put our trust in God, that's what happens. And I see a lot of things.
And the interesting part, I believe too, right? Again, is there anything wrong with owning a company or owning fields? No. But what they were doing, again, they were taking money from their laborers, or not paying them, I should say, not paying them, and that was what was wrong. And James says, listen, he says, these riches that you've gained from these things, he's like, man, they're like cankers, all right? It's going to destroy you, all right? Any other comments anybody has on these verses 1 through 6 tonight? All right. If not, don't allow possessions or riches, again, and the desires of this world, right, and the pleasures of this world, don't have the attitude or mindset that, hey, I just got to keep on lapping it up. Because listen, if they control us, that's what's going to happen. We're going to want more, or we're going to desire more, and then eventually, as James had said to these rich men, he said this, he's like, listen, it's going to destroy you eventually, all right, it's going to take you down. And in particular, the warning to them, that you might as well howl and weep because your miseries that are going to be coming upon you. All right, there's a time coming, judgment's coming. So, all right, if no other comments at all, let's stand. Again, appreciate you guys for being here tonight. Again, pray that you guys have a good rest of the week in the Lord. And again, just remember the prayer requests that were mentioned tonight, and also the prayer requests that were mentioned Sunday morning and Sunday night too. So, all right, if no other word at all, Brother Mark, do you want to dismiss us in a word of prayer tonight?